Hi, welcome to the video. Today I will be discussing arguments made by this guy. The channel is Trinity Radio, so you can check out the video. His name is Braxton, and I will be addressing this video to him. Hi Braxton. As I was uploading my last video response, I noticed a thumbnail of yours in relation to Tjump and the problem with his debate method. I thought this may be an interesting video, as Tjump's arguments are, from what I have seen, very clear and to the point compared to most debaters. You seem to have chosen two main reasons why you think his arguments should be basically ignored. One is that he requires certainty in a belief before he can believe it, and the other is that he uses a pinhole method of getting out of the force of an argument. Now this is kind of ironic, as my last video basically argued the exact same thing as what you were doing. Although I didn't use the word pinhole, I realize now that this is the perfect definition of what your ad hoc reasoning is. You had also directed these same accusations at Matt Dillahunty, and I will touch on that issue as well. I will start with Matt Dillahunty and his basic responses he gives to the hypothetical questions of, what if this miracle happened? Would you believe it? I think his response is not asking for certainty, as you are suggesting. When he says he doesn't know, he's actually being honest in saying that he's not sure how his brain would react to such an event occurring before his eyes. Whether or not he would be able to confirm that what he saw was real or just imaginary, or maybe what he saw did happen but the explanation may be completely different. For example, there are many claims made by people all over the world that they had an intense experience that they believe so strongly that this occurred in the way they think it occurred. Matt, having a live call-in show, has heard many of these claims firsthand, from UFOs to ghosts or direct connections to the divine, all of which are not believable, as the reasons they give for not only thinking that this event actually occurred, but that the causal explanation is the supernatural or extraterrestrial, are irrational. The fallacious reasons they usually give boil down to arguments from ignorance or incredulity. Now, I don't necessarily agree with Matt's response, or maybe the way he explains it could be a bit more precise, but it seems his arguments are in response to having so many direct interactions with these types of claims. He understands that human beings are, in general, quite irrational, and often have a hard time recognizing when something is real or just their brain creating this experience. His stated principles are that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that absolute certainty is unattainable. These basic principles he holds both explain the reasoning behind his answer and disproves your assertion that he's asking for certainty before believing. Now, my response to such a hypothetical question would be similar to what philosophers have suggested, that it may be reasonable for you to believe that such an event happened, but would not be reasonable for anyone else to believe. However, the explanation that you give to yourself, since there is no evidence to the cause of the events, is often anything that you think best explains it, which usually means for a believer in the supernatural, a supernatural explanation fits, and for someone who thinks that natural explanations are far more likely, then a natural explanation fits. And since we have implicit empirical evidence of natural explanations, they are therefore more likely. Again, this has nothing to do with certainty, and is simply proportioning belief to the evidence that you have. This is when you start directing the argument to Tom Tjump. You play a clip of Tom explaining that we cannot say we have absolute certainty that supernatural does not exist based on our current knowledge, and that the same is true for believers. They cannot say that God wasn't created by another God, for example, as our current knowledge does not get us there. You claim that he's making the argument that he requires absolute certainty, And then you went on to discuss why Christians can claim that God has the omni attributes. His argument is simply a foundational argument for we cannot disprove a negative. His argument continues to then discuss the omni attributes. It can be summarized into, if you are claiming that a being knows everything, you would need to know everything to be able to know God knows everything. Or claiming a being is all-powerful, you wouldn't be able to say that, as there may be something more powerful that created it. If you proportion your evidence, then there wouldn't be enough evidence to make these claims. Essentially, Christians should claim that God has finite properties, so that there is at least the possibility of providing some evidence that they may be true. Tjump's philosophical argument does discuss certainty in relation to infinites, and he makes the distinction between what is true in reality compared to what is in your head. But he's not saying you require absolute certainty to believe in God or Christianity. And Doherty agrees by saying that he is using a different definition of the word know, and that a finite God is all that is required. And then they move on to the evidence-based arguments. This is a very honest position by Doherty, and it would be great if more believers adopted it. You then made a side argument that if atheists said, if God exists, and if God did raise Jesus from the dead, that wouldn't show that Christianity was true either, claiming this to be your example of pinhole thinking. It would, by our agreeing to the premises, show that a God exists, and that Jesus was raised from the dead, but it does not follow that the claims surrounding that event, made many decades later, are reliable. Most of the claims of the Bible can be false, for instance, original sin, or that Jesus was the Son of God and died for our sins, even if Jesus was raised. Those things don't follow. Now, obviously, if we agree to those premises, we wouldn't really be atheists anymore, but we still need to point out the fallaciousness of accepting all the claims of the Bible. If I believe now that the Bible is unreliable, then and then we somehow get scientific evidence that a God existed and then raised a Jewish rabbi from the dead, this would not change my initial understanding of the reliability of the Bible, as all of those arguments still stand. Now, this hypothetical would be a basic proposition of God. It does not require God to be all-powerful, uncreated, or all-loving, etc. It just requires a God that is capable of completing these tasks. This is the God that Tjump is wanting Christians to argue for, as it is easier to provide evidence for, and is the simplest version of a God, meaning that it conforms to Occam's razor. This would then relate to Tjump's second argument for epistemology, that is in regards to evidence. And this does not require anything like absolute certainty. In fact, all it requires is some evidence that it exists. Your next tangent was about atheists that believe in the positive claim that God does not exist. Now, you were complaining about burden of proof, and since that burden of proof only applies to positive arguments, then those atheists would require some evidence that a timeless, bodiless mind did not exist, and that is impossible. So a debate defined in that manner would be pointless, as any garbage argument made for the existence of God would be better than no evidence that a God does not exist. The only thing that can be done in that debate would be to show just how worthless those arguments are, therefore making the debate a wash. Now, if the debate topic was the reliability of the Bible, for example, then we could show that Christianity was not a tenable position to hold, and we could do the same for all other religions. You brought the discussion back to Tjump by saying that he attempted to disprove certain gods, existing based on the specific definition that was given. I take this to be the God is all-loving, therefore could not create a world with unnecessary suffering argument. Tjump actually includes consent in that suffering in his version of the argument. But Jones, in the debate, didn't seem to understand that part of the argument at all. I do not consider these arguments to be worthwhile because the response given by Christians, including yourself in this video, is the perfect definition of a pinhole argument. This is a quote from you. All the Christian has to show is any possible reason why such a God might have done it in the way that he did. This is an argument made by someone not interested in finding the truth. They are attempting to get out of the force of the argument in any way possible. Tjump says that if the God forces us to be in a world with involuntary suffering, that is by definition immoral. To which you say, unless there is some overarching good that justifies having done this. And also to which Jones, in the debate, goes off on a tangent about the details of such a world with voluntary suffering, completely ignoring Tjump's argument. But the question is, what overarching good could justify such an immorality? God would also be the arbiter of what counts as a justification, meaning that anything that God said was justification for his not good action would be a justification for it being a good action instead. How convenient that God can do all of these immoral things, but simply say they are not immoral. Jones himself said that because God created this all-good place called heaven, this balances out any immoral actions taken before that, even though not everyone gets to experience this all-good existence. This argument of yours appears to be asking for absolute certainty that God's actions are immoral, and is clearly a pinhole assertion to get out of the force of the argument. Also, you didn't disagree with the argument that these actions would be immoral. In other words, we are saying that God's actions by definition are immoral, and you're saying we haven't proven that to a Cartesian certainty because God can do anything. Pretty much the same ad hoc assertion we get for any God argument. What's worse about it is that you're not saying that you have an argument against this. You are saying that you may have an argument, but you don't know what it is. Well, until you do have that argument, I think it stands that by definition, God's actions are immoral. Your next example was the Liz Jackson debate, in which Tjump is pointing out that with zero evidence for any one particular version of heaven or the rules for getting there, then they are all just as likely as each other. This is an obvious true statement, but for which you claim is pinhole thinking. You are attempting to support your claim by appealing to popularity. By asking people on the street what actions would be more likely to get them into heaven, more people would respond with good actions. This, of course, lends no weight to the truth of the argument, and since people already live in a society that commonly holds that belief, they are, of course, more likely to answer in that way. But they are just claiming, they're just biased by the society that they are brought up in. Strange that you claim Tjump is pinhole thinking, and your response is to use an obvious fallacy to suggest that what he is saying is unreasonable. You then try to make the argument that it is in fact more likely to get into heaven by being a theist or by good actions, due to the existence of moral intuitions. Firstly, you are begging the question by inserting God and what God wants, and asserting God gave us the moral intuitions into the equation before you analyze possible results. Secondly, Liz herself included in her paper a naturalistic afterlife that would reward rational thinking, which obviously doesn't require a god. Or you could have a naturalistic afterlife that does not pick and choose who gets into heaven. Just everyone gets in. After all, it is infinite, so there's no real reason to exclude anyone from it. Meaning that we don't need to posit a being to create it, this afterlife, or posit the wants and needs and desires of that being, suggesting it is in fact you violating Occam's razor by having these additional variables. You made a curious statement that, quote, what is necessary to explain the phenomenon? Of course, the problem with this is we do not have a phenomenon to explain. It is simply an invention of human minds that an infinite heaven exists, and until more than zero evidence has been provided to support it, the rational position is to not accept it. To conclude, Tjump is asking for Cartesian certainty for one particular type of claim, claims about infinites. For all other claims, including some God concepts, he is clearly not requesting certainty, but any evidence at all. Now, if you think basic epistemology and rational thinking is equivalent to pinhole thinking, then you clearly haven't even analysed your own arguments. As showcased by your video, it is full of fallacies and pinhole assertions. The only way you can get out of the force of a rational argument is to project onto someone else. Once again, it is obvious your conclusion is already set, and if anything challenges that view, then ad hoc assertions and pinhole thinking is the only way out. I do agree with your last statement, however, that pinhole thinking should be called out and dismissed. That is why I am responding to your arguments. Well, I hope this clears up pinhole thinking and who is employing it. If you have any questions, then I'm sure you can find a way to ask them. Thank you for your time.